So last Wednesday, Biden went out to Pittsburgh, and at 5 in the morning, the White House released a 12,000-word fact sheet on what they call the American Jobs Plan. And this is the infrastructure plan we've been hearing about. Embedded in it are his climate actions. But the 1,200 words hardly even mentions the climate emergency. Just in passing, it says it'll be, good for reducing carbon without having any goals or timetables in most cases. And the climate emergency really demands a radical decarbonization on a rapid timetable. And that can only be met by an eco-socialist approach that features public enterprise and planning. The eco-socialist Green New Deal budget we put out there, we analogize to the World War II emergency, where the federal government took over a quarter of manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into the arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascists. And what we have here in Biden's plan is corporate welfare, subsidies and market-based incentives for clean energy that will take uncertain effect at a leisurely pace. They don't have any sense of urgency. Greta Thunberg, should be scolding them like she has world leaders around the world. And the scale of how much money they're planning to spend to try to transform our economy to clean energy is pathetic. It is not serious, and I'll get into some of the details. And when I say it's too late for gradualism, let's just remember where we are. James Hansen famously set an initial target back in 2008 with his climate science colleagues that we should aim for 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 350 ppms. And that compares to a pre-industrial level of 280 ppms. And during the Holocene, that's the period in which humanity, post-Ice Age, developed agriculture and civilization, has never got higher than 350 parts per million until the last 4 decades. So we blew through that 350 parts per million budget in 1988. So three and a half decades ago. And in February, we averaged 416 parts per million. And on April 3rd, a few days ago, the reading at Mauna Kea Observatory in Hawaii was 421 parts per million. That's a record. The last time atmospheric carbon was this high was in the middle of the Pliocene epoch, 3.3 million years ago, when the temperature was, in Fahrenheit, 11 degrees higher, that's 6 degrees Celsius, and sea levels were 40 meters or 130 feet higher than today. That's baked into the climate system now, unless we draw this carbon out. And this rapid climate change entails more than just heat waves and extreme weather events, and as the coastal areas flooded cities, it's much more existential. And this is going to happen as we move towards the middle of the century, 2050. Mass extinctions, collapsing land and ocean ecosystems, which means collapsing agriculture and food shortages, and mass starvation, economic contraction, and increasing poverty in many respects, hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And of course, in that context, escalating social conflict and resource wars. This is really an apocalyptic scenario. Now, it may still be possible, citing James Hansen, he put out an optimistic scenario a couple years ago that if we start a rapid phase out of emissions of 6 to 10% per year and a radical transformation of our agriculture and massive reforestation, we may be able to capture enough carbon in the atmosphere to draw down carbon to below 350 parts per million by the end of this century. And then just hope that we haven't tipped off these reinforcing mechanisms that will push irreversible global warming beyond our control and into a climate catastrophe. But the problem is we're nowhere near the kind of scenario that Hansen proposed. The 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees by the International Panel on Climate Change projected that to have a 2/3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, the remaining carbon budget was 420 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Today, that budget is down to 280 gigatons. We're burning 42 gigatons a year, and we're going to blow through that budget by the end of 2027. And that's just to have a 2/3 chance. That's like playing Russian roulette with a 3-chamber pistol, and one of those pistols has a bullet. So the odds are not the kind of odds you want to start with. So this is an emergency. And Biden comes up with this plan that, it's outlined in 1,200 words. Congress and corporate lobbyists are going to be, pounding out something with this thing. There'll be horse trading. The policies of Biden have some good things in terms of targeting funds to disadvantaged communities and promoting union jobs. And it includes the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act. These are good social policies. Whether they survive this horse trading remains to be seen. They hope to have a bill that they can vote on in the summer. But instead of going into all the social policies, I'm going to focus on the climate impact of this campaign, of this plan. And as I said, the scale is pathetic. It calls for $2.25 trillion over 8 years. And for comparison's sake, the environmental movements, the big environmental groups, what's called the Green New Deal Network, that's 15 national progressive groups, unions, groups like the Sunrise Movement and the Sierra Club, progressive Democrats like Ed Markey and AOC, they have this Thrive agenda and a Thrive Act that they're going to introduce that calls for $10 trillion over 10 years. And that's more like it, but having read the literature, they almost just grab those numbers at random because they don't relate to how do you get the carbon down fast enough. They more emphasize the jobs, which is a good thing to do. Historically, the problem for the climate movement and the environmental movement is the corporate interests say we're taking jobs when that's not true. We're creating more jobs with environmental measures, including climate action. But that's what they've decided politically. They have compromised from what Bernie Sanders was offering in his Green New Deal, which was the only serious proposal that any of the Democrats put forward. It was an order of magnitude greater than any of the others. It was $16.3 trillion over 10 years. It would have created 20 million jobs. It would have got us to 100% clean power, electricity by 2030. And like we proposed in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, it would have done that mainly through the public sector, through the production and sale of power, building upon the existing power marketing administrations that come out of the New Deal, the old New Deal. And but different from us, he didn't clean up the other sectors, which is almost 3/4 of all carbon emissions, until 2050. But it was a serious proposal. And when we looked at their numbers, they didn't show their homework like we did, but they looked like they were on the mark. And then we have our plan, which is $41.7 trillion over 10 years. $27.5 trillion is for what we call the Green Economy Reconstruction Program, which is how we get to zero emissions, moving toward negative emissions, and 100% clean energy by 2030. And we choose that because the best climate scientists over the last 15 years have said that's the time frame we got to move. They were saying that like around 2010. We got to do it in a decade. Well, now we're 2021. So, we in our campaign said 100% clean energy by 2030. And so that's one part of the program. And I'll refer to it as I go through Biden's, through the different energy sectors. And then we had $14.2 trillion for an economic bill of rights. And this is something that was not diluted out of the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal that Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced. Pelosi never let them vote on it. McConnell had him vote on it because he wanted the Democratic presidential candidates from the Senate to go on the record. And those Democrats voted present, except 4 of them voted no with the Republicans on a non-binding Green New Deal that was watered down. It extended the deadline we were talking about from 2030 to 2050. And you have to understand that it was the Green Party, it was our signature issue in the last decade. And, it got picked up by the Democrats and they watered it down. They eliminated the ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is crucial. If that infrastructure gets built, the investors expect to be making money off that for 3 or 4 decades. And we're locked into burning fossil fuels unless, we have a revolution and condemn those facilities and build clean energy in their place. They eliminated the phase out of nuclear power. They eliminated the cuts to military spending to help fund this thing. So, that was what the best of what we got from the progressive Democrats, except for Bernie Sanders. And but one thing the non-binding resolution did, it referred to an economic bill of rights. So in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, we have a job guarantee, guaranteed income above poverty, Medicare for all, lifelong public education from preschool and child care through higher education and trade schools, and a secure retirement. So that's the other part of the eco-socialist Green New Deal. And it creates 38 million jobs, 38 million jobs. The problem is we got a shortage of labor. That's the bottleneck in that plan. So, you compare what we're talking about to what Biden's talking about. We're talking about 10 times more. The liberals are talking about roughly 5 times more. Sanders was talking about 4 times more. We're saying 10 times more. So that'll give you an idea. And if you look at these plans that I just outlined or referred to, the plan we put forward is the only one with a budget that tells you what it's going to cost, how many jobs it will create, what it will do. And we also talk about how to pay for it. But I'm not going to get into that so much. I mean, part of Biden's plan is raising corporate taxes. I'll just say on the financing, it'll cost us more not to borrow the money and get this done now than to neglect getting it done. Because what it will do to the ecosystems and the agriculture and the whole economy that depends on our environment and those ecosystem or environmental services, that will cost a hell of a lot more than borrowing the money and building this new green economy. So let's look at the sectors. The biggest sector in terms of energy consumption is transportation, 28% of our carbon footprint. And Biden proposes $621 billion. Our eco-socialist Green New budget proposes $6.8 trillion. This is over a 10-year period. The emphasis in the Biden transportation thing is roads and bridges, basically keeping the system we got going. But it does have a lot of money for electric vehicles. And actually, in this one case, the investment seems to be adequate to the need. Talks about building 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations by 2030 in 10 years. And that goal seems to be about right. Right now, we have 42,000 charging stations. The Center for American Progress estimated just to keep up with the demand. And you got to remember, companies like GE are going 100% electric vehicle. Massachusetts and California have already set deadlines. You can't buy or sell internal combustion engines in those states after 2035. So we're moving that way. Now, it's a big subsidy to the private auto industry to build their charging stations for them. But if that's what it takes to get there, that's good. And 15 years, the deadlines that California and Massachusetts set is consistent with the roughly 15-year turnover time for vehicles, for our vehicle fleet. There are 280 million vehicles. The criticism that we would have is that we want to move people out of individual vehicles into public transportation as much as possible. Because building all these vehicles and all this solar and wind capacity requires a lot of extraction of minerals and other resources from the earth. And while in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, we have a big investment in recycling, which isn't even mentioned in the Biden proposal, extracting materials from the earth. And if you're not recycling them, throwing them back as waste on the environment is a big problem. So it's much more energy and resource efficient to have most transportation, routine transportation, going to work, going to school, going to get your groceries in public transportation than a personal vehicle. So that would be a critique there. And then when they get to buses, and I don't quite understand how they could be so generous toward private vehicles, but stingy to the bus fleet. They say they will make sure there are 50,000. They will convert 50,000 buses to electric, and 20% of school buses. 50,000. There are about 1 million buses in this country. So, that is just not a serious proposal, particularly given that diesel exhaust is what causes the most problem in terms of particulates and, nitrogen and sulfur oxides that damage the lungs and kills people. Why that gets short shrift, I think, is a criticism. Now they talk about $85 billion for public transportation, which is a lot more than we've been spending. But just taking the New York City Transit Authority, they need an emergency influx of $12 billion just in the next year. So that's, like an eighth or a seventh of the national. And they want $51.5 billion by 2024 for their capital budget, because they have neglected keeping that system up, and it's had a lot of problems. So you put just what New York City needs in terms of the national investment, and the national investment barely covers New York City. What about the rest of the country? And they had $80 billion for Amtrak and freight rails, and Amtrak had put out a map right as soon as this came out, and it shows you around the country. They're mainly going to upgrade the routes they do have. They're going to add some, which is good. But when you look at that map and compare it to what they have in Europe, it's pretty sparse. So, this is not adequate to the need again. And transportation is the best sector, I think, in terms of what Biden has in his plan. When it comes to power, there's not a lot of commitment to investment. It's mainly a clean energy standard, which is technology neutral and requires a certain percentage of utility sales to be met by clean, zero or low carbon sources, such as renewables. They include nuclear energy and coal or gas fitted with carbon capture technology, which is not economical and still in development. And this is a very conservative idea. Lindsey Graham had a bill for this in 2010. And a conservative Democrat had a little bit better bill, Jeff Binghamton from New Mexico, in 2012. So that's the main thing. It's not public ownership and production and sale of clean power like we propose, like Bernie Sanders proposed. It's setting the standard and then having the utilities adapt to it, and they can use dirty energy like nukes and fossil fuels. And so they have $35 billion for climate research and development, but that includes carbon capture, includes quote unquote advanced nuclear, which is a catch-all phrase for small modular reactors and different cooling systems instead of water, molten salt, or high temperature gas or liquid metal. I mean, all this stuff is not new. It's not advanced. It has been tried in the nuclear era starting in the 50s, and it failed. This is a sales gimmick of the nuclear industry. It's not a serious proposal. And nuclear now costs more than most forms of solar and wind over the lifetime of producing the plant and then generating the electricity by 2 or 3 times. So why would you even talk about nuclear? after Fukushima, when we have a fleet of nukes that are supposed to have been retired after 40 years, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or as I like to refer to it, the Nuclear Rubber Stamp Commission, has extended the lifetime on some of these plants to 60 years, some of them to 80 years, some have applied for 100 years. And radiation embrittles the metal components, which means they're more likely to fail and create a catastrophic accident. And of course, none of these so-called advanced nuclear forms get rid of the nuclear waste problem, where you've got to store for hundreds of thousands of years highly radioactive and dangerous waste. So it's uneconomical, it's dirty, and it's dangerous. Yet it's promoted throughout this document. And if you want to know more about that, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a study last month called "Advanced Isn't Always Better," referring to this so-called advanced nuclear. They're not safer, they're not more economical. They actually increase the risks of nuclear proliferation and terrorism. And of course, there's the waste problem. And we have to understand that nuclear has never been profitable. It's probably the most failed industrial enterprise in the modern era, because it always, the insurance industry wouldn't insure them because the accidents were so bad, it would break the insurance industry. So we have the Price-Anderson Act, where the federal government partially insures us against catastrophic accidents. They can't even fully insure us. So the only reason I can conceive of is that, Biden wants to favor big corporate donors in the nuclear industry like GE and Westinghouse. I can't find of any rational reason to do that. And, he wants to talk a lot about jobs. For every dollar invested in the green economy of solar, wind, rails, and retrofitting buildings, 17 jobs are created, compared to 5 jobs when that same $1 million is invested in fossil fuels or nuclear energy. So even from his jobs framework, it doesn't make any sense at all. So that's the power sector. And just to sum it up, they're counting on investor-owned utilities, as we call them IOUs, to make the transition through this clean energy standard, but allow them to call nuclear and fossil fuels that they can define as low carbon, or the carbon is captured, as part of the mix. And, it's hard to believe their goal in this case is to get to 100% clean energy by net zero emissions by 2035. Be careful of that word net zero, because what it means is we're going to capture the carbon, or we're going to offset it. So we'll plant a tree, that would absorb carbon, and then you can pollute with carbon. And of course, we need those trees not just to offset emissions, we need them to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Because like I said before, if 350 parts per million carbon dioxide is the safety zone or the limit, and we're at over 421 just a few days ago, we not only have to stop emissions, we got to draw it out of the atmosphere. That's what planting trees should be about, not about offsetting, fossil fuels we're still burning in 2035 or even 2050, when they want to get to 100%, well, what do they call it? Net zero carbon emissions across all sectors by 2050. And as you go through these sectors, you could see it in transportation by the 2035. You could see it in power, maybe, but not in the other sectors. Buildings is a big sector. It's 12% of the carbon footprint. And they have $213 billion to build and retrofit. They say 2 million affordable housing units in commercial buildings. And they're going to build 1 million new electrified housing units in 500,000 homes. And then they're going to add 40 billion to improve public housing. Well, let's put this in context. There are 120 million buildings in this country. And if you're going to retrofit a maximum of 2 million over 8 years, I mean, do the math. That's 60 times 8. That's like half a millennium to retrofit all the buildings in the country. I mean, this is not a serious climate program. They come up with maybe 200, $250 million in the housing, the building sector. In our eco-socialist Green New budget, we had 6.5 trillion because we want to not only retrofit the buildings we got, we want to build 25 million new units of good public housing as a climate program because they'll be, clean energy powered, but also as a program to provide affordable housing to everybody, to realize that housing right in the Economic Bill of Rights, and also as a desegregation program. Public housing was used to increase segregation. It could also be used to desegregate us by race and class. European, what they call social housing, is a mix of not just poor people, but blue collar, middle income people and professionals. They all live in the same public housing or social housing developments. And that reduces the kind of segregation that creates concentrated and isolated poverty, which is a huge issue in this country. So they're not doing enough in the housing sector. And then the public housing, 40 billion for public housing. I mean, come on. The New York City Housing Authority alone needs 68.5 billion through 2028 to fix their terrible problems with lead, mold, elevators, boilers, roofs. In the winter of 2017, 80% of NYCHA residents went for periods without heat. It isn't just New York City where public housing has been neglected for the last 50 years. So that again is some money that will get some jobs to, people in the construction industry to do some repairs and upgrades, but it's not meeting the needs of public housing tenants, let alone the need for affordable housing. So as I said, we have a 10-year, $2.5 trillion investment to build 25 million units. That would cover the shortage of affordable housing, which the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a few years ago, they did what they call it, the housing gap study. And they found there were 7.5 million very low income people who couldn't find affordable housing and 400,000 homeless. That's probably got worse in the pandemic. And another statistic from that year is U.S. Department of Education. 1.5 million children experienced homelessness during the school year that year. So, the housing need now with, forget the number, it's billions in overdue rent. And the recent, COVID relief package had some money for that, but it's inadequate. And I don't know about where you live, but here in New York, they still haven't got that money to the tenants, and the deadlines are coming up. And we know in housing court here in Syracuse, they're evicting people now. So this is a huge crisis. And then in manufacturing, very little. There's a lot of talk about, supporting domestic semiconductor and medical supply chains and, federal government purchasing. There's $500 billion in annual federal purchasing to stimulate domestic manufacturing, particularly electric vehicles, the electric vehicle infrastructure. And they do mention heat pumps to replace gas and heating oil and propane in heating our homes, which is good. But they say nothing about technologies like cement, which is at least 5% of the world's carbon footprint, because it requires calcium carbonate. Calcium hardens the cement. The carbon evaporates into the atmosphere. And so it's a huge problem in terms of climate change. No discussion about transforming that industry to a form of cement that doesn't release carbon. And another example I like to use is steel manufacturing. It's mostly done by coke ovens. The industry itself is moving toward electric arc furnaces. But without public ownership and planning that we're talking about, those industries are going to wear out their coke ovens before they replace them with electric arc furnaces. And so what we do in the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget is go through key technologies we got to transform and talk about federal government building the machinery for these new industries. That's the machine tool industry, which is pretty much gone from this country. Those are the machines that make machines. And that needs to be rebuilt. Biden says nothing about that. And finally, agriculture, he says nothing. That's 10% of the carbon footprint, but it has enormous potential to draw carbon out of the atmosphere back into the biosphere by rebuilding soils with an organic regenerative agriculture system. The only thing he really touches on there is $10 billion for a civilian climate corps. This is token. This is, I mean, our budget, if I recall rightly, has $2 trillion over 10 years for, we call it, what Roosevelt called it, the Civilian Conservation Corps. That would be about afforestation and restoring habitat, and would operate around the world, not just in the United States, as part of a global Green New Deal. So, you know, his 10 billion compared to our 200 billion, that's 1/20th a year. Well, his is 10 billion over 8 years. So he's about, and we're talking about he's about 1/100th of what we see as the need if we're going to reforest all these areas that are being destroyed. And the other thing he says nothing about is the international dimensions of this. The U.S. is basically consuming the biodiversity of the Amazon and the rainforests in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and Papua, Malaysia. And, you know, those wood products come to us, they come to China, they come to the rich countries to the north. And basically we're leaving behind palm oil plantations or, you know, temporary cattle grazing for hamburgers that depletes the soil until it's useless. And so that, they call it the ecological debt. We talk about reparations, and this is called the climate debt. We need to invest in rebuilding those rainforests. And yes, it's a transfer of wealth from here to those countries, but it's also an investment in the fundamental habitability of the planet for all of us. So we all got a stake in that. So Biden is not up to the task. So I'll just wrap this up, and I went more than 15 or 20 minutes, but you know, what can we do at this point? Well, we got to keep speaking up for a real Green New Deal. And, you know, the Sunrise Movement, giving expression to this Green New Deal network. Tomorrow they have 65 demonstrations calling for a job guarantee, building the green economy. You know, we should be out there if there's a demonstration in our community, lending our voice to that and continuing to do that kind of thing. We really got to oppose fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. And Biden got a headline for a 60-day temporary ban on oil and gas leasing on public lands, which the right said was a fracking ban. It wasn't. That 60 days is up. That was January 30th. It was up last week. I haven't been able to find out if he's extended it or what, or it's just up. But we have won some battles on fracking. Delaware River Basin, which covers 4 states in the mid-Atlantic, banned fracking in that river basin. There's a bill in California. This is probably the key fracking ban fight, the frontline fight right now, to ban fracking there by 2027. And this is coming from the Democrats. You know, Chevron and those oil companies and the gas companies are going to fight them like hell. We need to get behind that bill. And then there are pipelines. We got Enbridge Line 6 stopped, but now, and we got the Keystone XL stopped, but there's still the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's Enbridge Line 3. There's the Mountain Valley Pipeline in the Mid-Atlantic. There's the Pacific Connector Pipeline. These are fights that we've got to engage and we can win. And then we got gas-fired power plants going up all over the country, which is what the pipelines are for. We have the Dance Camera plant and a new, I think it's a 500 megawatt plant they want to build in Astoria, Queens. So we got our fights here in New York, and I'm sure around the country you have them. And then finally, I think we got to fight back against this proposal to go with more nukes. You know, Obama administration subsidized nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. And because of cost overruns and construction delays. The nukes in South Carolina, they had to give them up. They're only still going in Georgia because Brian Kemp stole the governorship from Stacey Abrams a couple years ago, and he's a creature of Georgia Power and the Southern Company. But that's a fight right there. They're still pouring money down that waste hole. So there are, particular fights we can win, and we can keep speaking up for the real Green New Deal.